A rifle came up level at a woman her own chief had already cast out as cursed, a choice that would change both their lives forever. And it was a lonely cowboy, a stranger to her people, who stepped into the line of that shot. Neither of them saw it coming the day he first took her in. She had been blamed for a child's death that was never her fault, passed over by every warrior in the band for 2 winters running, offered off like a debt paid in horses. What that cowboy chose the moment she was set in front of him was not what anyone standing there expected, least of all her New Mexico territory, autumn of 1881, in the high country below the Mogollon Rim. Stay to the end, this one will not go where you expect. And if the story is worth something to you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. The Rim country above the Tularosa breaks a man's idea of distance. Wyatt Coulter had learned that the hard way, riding fence line that looked close on a map and took the better part of a day on a horse to actually reach. He was 31 years old, and he had run cattle on a section of graze at the foot of the Mogollon country for 6 years, since his father's heart gave out over a fence post one July morning and left the whole operation, debts and all, sitting on Wyatt's shoulders like a saddle 2 sizes too big. He had grown into it since. The herd was modest but sound. The water rights were his. By a decree nobody argued anymore. And the house he built with his own hands the first winter after his father died was tight enough to keep the wind out, if only barely. What the house did not keep out was the quiet. He kept a hired man half the year, a wandering sort named Purdy, who came through in spring and left before the first snow. And beyond that, Wyatt talked to his horses and his dog, and on the bad nights to the ceiling. He had courted a rancher's daughter down in Alma for the better part of a year before she married a freight agent with steadier prospects, and he could not entirely fault her for it. A woman weighs what a life is going to look like before she signs on to it, and a life alone on the Rim with a man who worked from can see to can't see had not been much of an offer. That had been 2 years back. He had not tried again since. There did not seem to be much point in trying at something he was plainly bad at. The house itself told the story of a man managing rather than living. 2 chairs at the table, only one ever pulled out. A second coffee cup on the shelf that had not been taken down in longer than he cared to count. His mother's quilt folded at the foot of a bed that had been his parents' and was now simply his, too large for one man and too full of memory to give away. He had thought some nights of selling off half the graze and moving into town, taking a room above the Mercantile in Alma, where at least there would be other voices through the walls. He never did it. A man does not sell land his father died defending just because the house built on it has gone quiet. Pride, he figured, more nights than not. Other nights, something closer to fear, the fear that leaving might prove the quiet had won. He kept busy the way men keep busy, when busy is the only medicine available to them. He mended what did not strictly need mending. He rode fence line twice a week that needed riding once. He had grown, without quite noticing the turn, into a man who preferred his own silence to another man's poor company, and had started to wonder, in the honest hours before sleep, whether that preference was a comfort or simply a habit he had mistaken for one. He rode east that October to trade for winter stock, 3 sound geldings he meant to swap for cattle or coin at the Chiricahua camp on Turkey Creek, a band that had stayed off the reservation rolls through some mix of luck and the particular stubbornness of their headman, a man named Nahil Zay. Wyatt had traded with the band twice before. They knew him well enough by now to let him ride in without an escort of rifles trained on his back, which in that country, in that year, was no small courtesy. The camp sat in a fold of hills where Turkey Creek cut down through sycamore and alder, brush shelters strung along the water, cook fire smoke standing straight up in the still morning air. Wyatt came in slow, the way a man learns to when he is alone, and outnumbered, and wants every eye on him to reach its own conclusion that he is no threat. Nahilze met him near the first shelter, a broad, weathered man with iron-colored hair and the stillness of someone who had buried more of his own people than he had ever wanted to count in the raids and the sickness and the long, grinding pressure of the reservation years. He and Wyatt had enough shared Spanish between them to trade in, along with a handful of words each had picked up from the other over the years. The negotiation for the geldings went the way these things went. Slow and unhurried men running their hands down foreleg and fetlock, checking teeth, arguing without heat over what was fair. It was nearly settled. 4 geldings for a dozen head of young stock, when Nahilze stopped and looked past Wyatt's shoulder toward a boy standing near the fire and sent him off with a few words in Chiricahua. The boy came back a few minutes later, and behind him walked a young woman, and the whole gathering shifted the way weather shifts, quick and total and impossible to miss. She was perhaps 20, slight through the shoulders, but with a straight-backed way of standing that did not match the way the men around her would not meet her eyes. Her hair hung long and black and unbraided that morning, which Wyatt would learn later was itself a kind of statement, a woman past caring what unbraided hair signaled to people who had already decided the worst about her. She wore a plain calico dress gone soft with washing, and carried herself like someone walking through a room full of people who wished she would simply not be there. Her name was Dyani. Nahilze did not soften the account that followed. Dyani was his brother's daughter, her mother lost to childbirth, her father fallen 4 winters back in a fight with soldiers along the Gila. Since then, the band had raised her as their own, until a hard winter 2 years passed, when sickness swept the camp and took, among 6 others, the infant son of a woman named Taji. Taji's husband, a respected fighting man named Bidzil, had needed somewhere to put his grief that was not simply grief, and Dyani, without a father or husband to speak for her, had made an easy target. He put it about that she had cursed the boy, that her lingering eye the week before had drawn the sickness to him. None of it was true, and Nahilze's face, when he laid the account out, held the flat certainty of a man tired of repeating a fact nobody around him wanted to hear. But belief rarely needs truth to spread, only fear and a convenient target, and by the time the sickness passed, half the band would not sit near a cook fire with her, and no young man in 3 seasons had so much as looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he might court. Nahilze's offer came direct, plain trading language with nothing dressed up about it. 4 more young horses, added to the dozen already agreed, if Wyatt would take Dyani to his ranch and give her a roof and a fair place in his household, an old man trying to solve the only way left open to him, a problem his own people's fear had created for a young woman he loved and could no longer protect. Wyatt did not answer right away. He looked at Dyani, and Dyani looked back without flinching and without hope. A woman who had learned exactly how much a stranger's first glance was worth, and had long since stopped expecting much from it. There was a version of himself, he thought later, that might have refused, out of plain caution, a stranger's daughter from another people brought into his house the talk it would stir in Alma and Reserve and every ranch between. But he had spent 2 years listening to windwork at his own roof, and he knew something about being the one other people quietly wrote off, though never so cruelly, and never for something that was not his own doing. His answer, careful trading Spanish, was that he would take her, and that she would have her own room and her own say under his roof. Not property, not a debt discharged, a person. Dyani did not smile at the translation, and she did not weep. She studied him a long moment, weighing whether he meant it or whether it was only a kinder shape for the same old arrangement, and then turned back toward the shelters without a word. She returned a quarter-hour later with a bundle wrapped in doeskin and a small wooden box that rattled faintly against her saddle horn, mounted the spare gelding without help, and did not look back at anyone gathered to watch her go. The dozen head of new stock were driven out ahead of them. Wyatt and Dyani, rode behind in a silence that held for the better part of 2 hours, west and then south, the rim falling away behind into the long yellow grass of the lower valley. Once, coming down off a ridge, her horse spooked at a rattler coiled in the trail brush, and she brought the animal under control herself before Wyatt had even turned his head, a small, economical movement that told him more about her than an hour of talk would have managed. His halting Kirikawa managed a compliment on her riding. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise, and not quite anything else he could name, and let the silence answer for her. And they rode on. The house looked smaller than he remembered it, the way any house looks smaller the moment before you bring someone new into it. He showed her the room off the kitchen that had been his mother's sewing room years before both his parents were gone to the same fever, the same house grieving twice over. He'd used the room for storage since, and it took him and Purdy the better part of an afternoon to clear it and set up a bed frame that had sat unused in the barn. Dyani watched him work without offering to help a test, he understood correctly, of whether the offer of her own room had been real or only words spent cheaply. That night, she closed the door herself. Wyatt ate cold beans out of the pot at his own table and listened to the house creak, and for the first time in 2 years, he could not tell whether the quiet in it felt the same as it had the night before. The first weeks carried their own particular weight, the kind that comes from two people learning to trust a silence neither one had chosen. Dyani kept largely to her own room and her own tasks, rising before dawn and retiring soon after dusk, and Wyatt let her keep that distance without comment, understanding it for what it was, a woman testing, day by careful day, whether the arrangement he'd promised in front of Nahilze would hold once there was no one left to hold him to it. He made a point of never entering her room, never so much as standing in its doorway uninvited, and he made a point, too, of never once suggesting she owed him gratitude for a roof any decent man would have offered a stranger in genuine need. Some debts, he had come to understand even before she arrived, went sour the moment a man started keeping score of them. Purdy, still on, through that first autumn, watched the careful distance between them for the better part of 2 weeks, before he ventured an opinion, delivered while the two men mended a stretch of fence well out of Dyani's earshot. He allowed that he'd seen plenty of arrangements like this one go bad in his years drifting through the territory, men who took in a woman from another people and treated the taking in as though it settled some manner of claim on her. Wyatt's answer, shorter than he meant it, was that there was no claim, none at all, and Purdy let the matter drop and never raised it again, though Wyatt noticed him watching. In the weeks that followed, with something that looked less like suspicion and more like a man waiting to be proven wrong about the world in a way he'd welcome. She was up before him the next morning. He found her at the stove, the fire already built, a pot of coffee working, and she had pulled his broken porch chair in from where it had rotted against the barn wall for the better part of a year, studying the split leg with the look of someone who meant to fix it before the day was old. He poured himself coffee, he set a second cup near her without asking, and went out to see to the stock. By the time he came back, the cup sat empty, and the chair leg was bound tight with a strip of rawhide from her own bundle, tighter and truer than the nail he'd been meaning to drive into it for months. His thanks came first, in English, then in the one Chiricahua word Nahilze had once taught him, fumbled and rough. Something in her face loosened at that, not quite a smile, close enough to be its cousin. Then she returned to her work. That became the shape of the weeks that followed. Language between them built slowly, out of Wyatt's scattered Chiricahua and Dyani's Spanish, better than she had first let on, held back the careful way a person holds back anything valuable, until certain it will not be wasted on someone who won't value it in return. As the weeks passed and nothing about the household proved false, she spent that Spanish more freely, and Wyatt caught himself listening for it the way he used to listen for rain on a dry summer evening. Small things began to surface first. She would not eat until he had. She swept the porch each morning before the sun cleared the ridgeline, a habit she never explained, and one he was careful never to make into a question. She kept the wooden box from Turkey Creek beneath her bed and touched it, some evenings the way a person touches a scar, to be sure it has actually healed. Across many porch evenings that followed, in pieces, Wyatt came to understand the full shape of the winter the sickness came through. Tadgie's boy had sickened alongside 5 other children that same week, and 4 of the 6 had died, Dyani's own younger cousin among them, a boy she had nursed herself through 3 days and nights of fever before he passed in her arms. Bidzil had needed somewhere to put his grief that was not simply grief, and Dyani, without a father or a husband left to speak for her, without standing in the band beyond Nihilze's protection, had made an easy target. He repeated the story with enough conviction, enough times, that even people who had once been kind to her began crossing to the far side of the fire when she sat down. She recounted all of this without asking for pity, the plain recitation of a hard winter, this many head lost, this much snow. This is simply what happened. The first time she laid the whole account out, Wyatt's answer was blunt. Bidzil was a coward twice over, once for needing someone smaller than himself to blame, and twice for choosing a woman with no one left to defend her. No dressing it up, the same tone he'd used to report a fence down or a creek run dry. She studied him a long while afterward, weighing whether he believed what he'd just said, or was only offering comfort because comfort cost him nothing. Whatever she found in his face satisfied her. She looked back, out at the dark hills, and let the matter rest. By the time the first hard frost came, the quality of the silence between them had changed completely. It had begun as the silence of 2 strangers too careful to risk a wrong word. For a while it became the silence of 2 people with more to say than either had language for. By November, it had turned into something else. Again, a silence with an ease inside it, the kind 2 people fall into, only once neither is performing anything for the other's benefit. There were smaller proofs of that ease scattered through the full. She began leaving a second cup of coffee out without being asked, matching the habit he'd started with her. She corrected his Chiricahua pronunciation with a small shake of the head, and no explanation until he got it right, and then a nod, brief and satisfied, was all the reward either of them needed. He started leaving his boots by the door instead of tracking mud through the kitchen, a small courtesy he had never bothered with for himself alone. Wyatt caught a chest cold in the first week of December that laid him flat for the better part of 4 days, fever climbing at night until the room seemed to tilt beneath him. He woke on the second night to a poultice laid warm across his chest, some bitter desert plant he could not name, and a clay cup of tea gone cold on the crate beside his bed. Dyani had already left the room by the time full waking found him. He never learned exactly where she found those plants in the dead of a New Mexico winter, only that by the 4th morning his fever had broken and his lungs had cleared, and that she had not slept more than a few scattered hours the whole time, though she never once mentioned the cost of it. She began teaching him things he had lived on that land 6 years without learning: which brush the cattle would founder on if the graze ran thin, how to read a smear of high cloud for the weather it promised 2 days out, how to dry mesquite pods into meal that would carry a household through a lean stretch without needing to slaughter stock. A man could not spare. Wyatt had thought himself a careful rancher. Watching her, he came to understand that careful and observant were not always the same thing, and that he had managed only the first without fully managing the second. The lessons went both directions, though it took Wyatt longer to notice that part of it. He taught her the count of his cattle by ear, the particular low that meant a calf had strayed from its mother versus the low that meant nothing at all. He taught her to read the mail that came up from Alma twice a month, sitting beside her at the table some evenings with his father's old primer, sounding out words slow and careful the way a much younger man might have. And she took to the letters with a hunger that told him something about how much of her life had been spent unable to read what mattered to her. By February, she was reading the newspaper he brought back from town before he had a chance to himself, frowning over the territorial politics of a place that had never once asked her opinion on anything, and reporting back to him at supper what fool thing the legislature in Santa Fe had done that month. There was a night in late January when a hard wind came down off the rim and rattled every loose board in the house, and Wyatt came out from his room to find her sitting up at the table with a lit lamp, not frightened, simply awake, listening to the wind the way a person listens to something they respect. He sat across from her without a word. Neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour. When the wind finally settled toward morning, she looked at him and said, in the plain English she was growing more confident in by the week, that his house held together better than it had any right to. He told her that was likely her doing as much as his father's original work, the rawhide lashing she'd added to the worst joints over the winter, having outlasted every nail he'd ever driven. She almost smiled at that. It was becoming a familiar almost, one he had started to watch, for the way a man watches the horizon for weather he is hoping will arrive. There was a morning in February when a late blizzard caught 6 head of his cattle out past the north fence, and Wyatt rode out into weather that would have killed a less careful man, only to find Dyani had gone out ahead of him before first light, having read the sky the evening before in a way he had not yet learned to. She had already turned the strays back toward the home pasture by the time he caught up to her, moving through blowing snow with a certainty that came from a childhood spent reading exactly this kind of country. He did not thank her in words that day. He simply rode alongside her the rest of the way home, and something about riding together through weather that could have killed either of them alone said what words would have only made smaller. There was a skill of hers Wyatt did not fully see until late that same February, on a still cold afternoon when a coyote had been working too close to the henhouse for 3 nights running. He'd gone out with his rifle twice and missed both times, the animal too quick and too far in the failing light. On the 3rd evening, Dyani took the rifle from its pegs without asking, walked to the edge of the yard and dropped the coyote at a distance. Wyatt would not have attempted himself a single shot, unhurried, the kind of shot that came from years of practice rather than luck. She handed the rifle back to him afterward without comment, as though the matter were entirely unremarkable, and went back to the house to finish the supper she'd left on the stove. Wyatt stood in the yard a long moment turning that over. It would be nearly 2 months before he understood exactly how much that quiet skill would come to matter. The winter had one more lesson left in it before it broke. A wolf pack, driven down out of the high country by the hard cold, took to shadowing the herd through most of a bitter week in late February, and it was Dyani who first noticed the pattern of their movement, reading tracks in the crusted snow that told her more about the pack's intentions than Wyatt's 6 years on that land had ever taught him to see. Between the two of them, working the herd closer to the barn each night and standing watch in shifts, they lost not a single head. That whole hard week, a thing Wyatt would later count among the proudest stretches of work he had ever done, precisely because it had not been his work alone. One gray morning in January, he found her out by the corral fence, with the wooden box from Turkey Creek open on the rail in front of her, turning something over in her hands. He asked, in the trading language that had become mostly English by then, with a scatter of Chiricahua words neither bothered translating any more, what it was. She held it up, a small carved horse, rough-worked, plainly made by a child's hand, her cousin's, the one who had died in her arms. She had kept it 4 winters. No tears in the telling. She simply held the small horse a while longer, wrapped it back in its cloth, and returned the box beneath her bed, and the careful, unhurried way she did it told Wyatt that showing him at all had been its own kind of trust, one she had not extended to a living soul since the boy died. He found himself doing things without deciding to do them first. Leaving coffee on the stove in the mornings in case she rose after he'd already gone out. Clearing the mesquite grown thick against her east window so the morning light would reach her bed properly. mending the sticking latch on her door ahead of a dozen other repairs waiting on him. He did not examine these habits closely. They were simply what a man did for someone who had become, without his quite marking the day it happened, the person he thought of first whenever anything in the house needed tending. Herdy, back for the spring work in March, put into words what Wyatt had not let himself say aloud. He watched Dyani cross the yard one morning with a bucket in each hand, refusing, as always, the help she had not asked for, and observed, not unkindly, that a man would have to be dead from the neck up to miss what stood plain in front of him. Wyatt told him to mind the fence line and not another man's business. Purdy grinned and went to mind the fence line. The words stuck anyway. The way words do when they finally name something a man has been carefully not naming to himself. Purdy was not the only one who noticed. A trip into Alma for supplies in early March put Wyatt across the counter from Ezra Kellum, who ran the mercantile and considered himself by long habit entitled to an opinion on every household within 30 miles. Kellum wondered aloud, not quite as carelessly as he wanted it to sound, how long Wyatt figured on keeping an Apache woman under his roof, and whether he'd given thought to what the ladies' aid over at the church might have to say about it come summer social season. Wyatt paid for his flour and his coffee, and answered in a voice pleasant enough that it took the older man a moment to hear the iron underneath it. Dyani would be under his roof exactly as long as she cared to stay, and any lady with an opinion on the matter was welcome to bring it to him directly instead of trading it second-hand across a counter. Kellum did not raise the subject again. Word of the exchange, as word did in that country, reached the ranch before Wyatt himself got home, carried by a rider who'd overheard it, and Dyani said nothing about it that evening beyond a long, measuring look across the supper table, the kind that told him she had heard and that it had mattered to her more than she was prepared to say out loud yet. By the middle of March she had taken to riding out with him on the days he checked the herd, at first simply alongside, and then as the weeks wore on, taking half the section on her own while he rode the other, the two of them meeting back at the barn near dusk to compare what each had found. It was, Wyatt realized one evening, watching her unsaddle her own horse, without waiting on him to do it for her, the first time since his father died, that the ranch had felt like it belonged to more than one person's shoulders. Spring brought its own small proofs. Dyani began humming, low and almost inaudible, while she worked the garden bed she'd started at the south wall, a habit that stopped dead the moment she noticed Wyatt within earshot, and resumed the second she believed herself alone again. He never let on that he'd heard it. Some things, he'd come to understand, needed to stay a woman's own for a while longer before a man was allowed to claim any part of them. There was an afternoon in late March when Wyatt came back from town with a bolt of good wool cloth, not asking, simply setting it on the table where she'd find it, the way she had once set a second cup of coffee near him without asking. She said nothing about it for 2 days. On the third day he found a shirt half finished on the table, cut and stitched in a pattern he did not recognize, clearly meant for him, clearly not yet ready to be acknowledged as a gift rather than simply a project she happened to be working on. He said nothing either. He understood by then the particular grammar of gifts given sideways, offered without the vulnerability of a direct hand extended, and he had learned to receive them the same quiet way they were given. By April, the two of them had settled into a rhythm that neither had experienced with another person before, not quite marriage, and not quite anything either of them had a ready word for, but something steady and load-bearing in the way good rope is load-bearing, tested daily and found each time, equal to the weight put on it. The ranch itself had changed by then in ways a stranger riding through might not have noticed at first glance, but which Wyatt noticed constantly, the way a man notices the slow greening of a hillside after a hard winter. The garden at the south wall had doubled in size from its first modest plot. A second corral had gone up near the barn, built mostly by Dyani's own hand over 3 patient weekends, meant to keep the young stock separate from the breeding mares in a way that cut their winter losses nearly in half. The house smelled most evenings now, of dried herbs hung along the kitchen rafters, sage and yarrow and a half-dozen desert plants, Wyatt still could not reliably name, put up against whatever illness or injury the coming season might bring. It was, by any honest measure, no longer only his ranch. It had become, through nobody's single decision, the two of them. There were harder days folded into that same spring, too. Days worth naming, honestly, rather than smoothing over. A late-season storm took the roof off the equipment shed in a single violent hour, and the two of them spent 3 straight days rebuilding it before the next rain could ruin what stock feed remained inside, working side by side in a cold drizzle that left them both half-sick with exhaustion by the 3rd evening. Dyani took a bad cut across her palm hauling lumber that same week, deep enough that Wyatt insisted on riding for the doctor in Alma, and she refused just as flatly, cleaning and binding the wound herself with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything else, proof enough by then that Wyatt no longer needed. That she was not a woman who required rescuing so much as a woman who had simply never before been given the chance to be anything else. The trouble came in April, riding in off the South Road, in the shape of 3 men who did not announce themselves the way honest travelers did. Wyatt was out at the west section mending wire when the horses reached him, something in their pace, hard and unhesitating, that brought him back to the yard faster than good sense alone would have called for. He rounded the barn to find them already there. 2 of the 3 were white men he did not recognize, wearing the loose, unbothered look of men, paid to bring someone back regardless of how that someone felt about it. The 3rd was Chiricahua, younger than the others, a rifle laid easy across his saddle, and it took Wyatt only a moment to place the set of that jaw against everything Dyani had described across a dozen porch evenings. Bidzil. Dyani stood at the corner of the house. She had not run, had not called out. She simply stood, and when Wyatt drew up beside her, his name for the rider came from her low and flat, the way a person names a storm they have watched build on the horizon for some while and are no longer surprised to see arrive. The 2 white men carried a paper, or claimed one. "Talk on the reservation lines," they explained, cheerful in the particular way of men who treated other people's lives as an errand, of Chiricahua women who had left without leave and could be returned for a fee paid by certain interested parties. The paper itself came out at an angle that made it impossible to actually read, which told Wyatt everything he needed to know about what was written on it, if anything at all. Bidzil offered nothing. He only watched Dyani with the flat, patient look of a man who believed himself, at long last, about to be handed back something he had decided was owed him. Wyatt's answer was even. Dyani lived on his land, under his roof, by her own choice and his both, and any man wishing to argue otherwise could carry his paper to a territorial judge in Alma and let the law read it instead of waving it about at a safe distance. The reply came back that this was not how the business worked. Wyatt's own reply was that he had watched this exact business worked in this exact territory for the better part of 10 years, and a man unwilling to let his paper be read had already told you what it was worth. The 2 hired men traded a look, the look of men who did their work best when no one stood ready to argue back. Then one went for his revolver. Wyatt was already moving, but a half-beat behind, and in the falling space of that half-beat, he understood the mistake might cost him everything. The shot that actually rang out came not from his own gun but from behind him, close enough to feel in his chest. He turned. Dyani stood at the corner of the house with the old rifle. He kept loaded on pegs inside the kitchen door, and her shot had gone into the dirt between the horse's forelegs, close enough to send all 3 animals rearing and scattering in a tangle of hooves and shouting that broke the clean moment the 2 gunmen had been counting on. Wyatt's own shot went into the air above Bidzil's head, close enough to be understood, not close enough to be mistaken for a killing shot, a line drawn plain enough that no man there could pretend to misread it. Bidzil held on Dyani through the panicking horses for a long measuring count. Whatever he found in her face was not what he had ridden 2 days to collect. His horse turned south. The two hired men, robbed now of the easy advantage they had ridden in, counting on, followed him. They did not come back. Wyatt stood in the settling dust of the yard, his heart going hard enough to feel in his own throat, and looked to Dyani, who still held the rifle level at the empty road, waiting until she was satisfied the danger had actually passed and was not merely circling back. When she finally lowered the barrel, her hands carried the particular steadiness of someone who had settled a decision inside herself well before that morning arrived, and had simply been waiting for the moment that would ask her to act on it. It was only later that evening, once the horses had been checked, and the fence at the yard's edge mended where the panicked animals had splintered a rail, that the full shape of what had happened truly settled over Wyatt. She had not frozen. She had not waited on him to act first, the way most people, man or woman, freeze in the space before a gun goes off. She had read the moment, understood exactly what was needed, and delivered it with a single unhurried shot, placed precisely where it would do the most good and the least harm, the same steady hand that had dropped a coyote at 40 yards without a second thought back in February. He understood, turning it over at the supper table that night, that the woman Nahilze's own people had once called cursed and worthless had just proven herself, without a wasted motion or a raised voice, the most capable person on that entire stretch of ground. His words came rough. In Chiricahua, "You did not have to do that." Her answer came back in English, careful and complete, the sentence of a woman who had been saving it up for exactly this occasion. "Yes, I did." His laugh, when it came, was short and helpless, the shape a man's relief takes when it is too large for any other shape available to him. She watched him a moment with something careful still in her expression, and then, for just a breath, the corner of her mouth moved, the closest thing to open joy he had seen on her face since she'd first walked into his yard the autumn before. Word travels fast in that country when it carries the right kind of shape to it, and this was exactly that kind. Within 2 weeks, a rider came down from Turkey Creek, not as a warning, but as a courtesy. Chino, one of Nahilze's sons by marriage, quiet and deliberate, sat at Wyatt's table and spoke with Dyani in Chiricahua for the better part of an hour, while Wyatt followed perhaps 1 word in 5. The message Chino had ridden 2 days to deliver was this: news of what happened at the ranch, and news of who had ridden away from it with nothing, had reached the band, and it had done in a single afternoon what 4 years of quiet unfairness had never managed on its own. Bidzel, standing among his own people, had finally completely given out. The last of those who had half believed his old story about a cursed woman stopped believing it the moment word reached them that the cursed woman had stood her ground with a rifle while 2 grown men who'd come to take her turned and ran instead. Chino carried 1 more piece of news before he rode back north, something that left Dyani very still at the table. Wyatt asked her later what it had been. She took a long while finding English for it. And Nahilze wished her to know that the door of the camp had never truly closed against her, whatever anyone might once have led her to believe, and that if she ever wished to come home, even only to visit, she would be welcomed as exactly what she had always been, his brother's daughter, and no less than that. That same evening, Wyatt asked what she meant to do with the offer. She looked a long while out the east window where the last daylight lay across the floor in a strip of gold, and admitted finally that she did not yet know, that she had gone so long without anyone offering her a genuine choice that she had nearly forgotten the shape of having one at all. His own answer surprised him with how plainly it came out, that he understood that better than she might expect. A man who had spent 2 years assuming his life had already been decided for him by a quiet house and a dead-heavy ranch, only to learn otherwise once someone finally walked into his yard and proved him wrong. Spring came on hard and green along the draws that year, the kind of spring that seems to arrive all at once after a long winter of waiting for it. Dyani put in a garden on the south side of the house, riding alone into the trading post at Alma for seed in a clay jar, offering no explanation for the choosing of it, and Wyatt never asked, understanding by then that some things a person needed to arrive at in their own time, and their own silence. There were other small changes that spring, easy to miss if a man was not paying attention, the exact kind of attention Dyani had spent the winter teaching him. She left her hair unbraided more often now, not as a statement to anyone watching, simply because she wanted it that way. She hummed openly in the garden and did not stop when he came within earshot. She began teaching him full sentences instead of scattered words, patient in a way that told him she expected the language to matter for a good while yet. It was a warm evening near the end of April when his name came across the table, quiet, not looking up from a strip of beadwork she had been slow working for weeks, a pattern in red and deep blue against tanned hide. He set down the letter from his sister. In Silver City he had been reading without truly reading. Her words when they came were the plain, chosen English she saved only for what mattered most to her, that she would stay if he wanted her to, that she would stay in this house, on this land, not because a chief had once offered her up as settlement for a debt owed in horses, but because she had decided it herself, the first real decision anyone had allowed her to make in 4 years. Wyatt turned over all the ways a man might answer a sentence. Like that, the careful ways, the ones that left every door open behind them in case a person wanted to walk back through later. What came out instead was the plain truth of it, that he had ridden into that camp on Turkey Creek looking to trade for stock, and had ridden out with the one thing in this life he would burn the whole ranch to the ground before he let any man take from him again. She held his eyes, then the way she had that very first day at Turkey Creek, steady and unflinching. Except that it was an entirely different look now, because now she knew him and he knew her, and the holding had become something settled between them instead of something each was still busy measuring in the other. She returned to her beadwork. He returned to his letter. The fire in the stove popped once, low and easy, and that, between the two of them, proved answer enough. Nahilze rode down himself in May with 2 of his sons, and Wyatt met him at the gate the way a man meets someone he has come to think of without quite deciding to as family. Nahilze brought a blanket dyed in ochre and black, and a clay pot his own wife had shaped and fired, and a pair of moccasins sized, somehow, exactly to Wyatt's feet. Wyatt gave back a strong young colt out of his best mare and a sack of good coffee, and the 2 men shook hands with the particular weight men give a thing that has already become true and is only now being said plainly out loud between them. The wedding, when June brought it, was a small thing held at the ranch under a brush arbor, Wyatt and Purdy built with their own hands, Nahilze's family riding down for it alongside the handful of Alma neighbors, who had, in the end, found far less to gossip about than they'd expected once they actually sat across a table from Dyani. Even Ezra Kellum rode out for it, bringing a bolt of good blue cloth as a gift, and staying long enough to eat 2 full plates of the food Nahilze's wife had brought down from Turkey Creek, which Wyatt privately counted as more of an apology than the mercantile owner would ever manage to put into actual words. No minister for miles could have made the day any more binding than the 2 of them standing in front of the people who mattered most and saying so plainly themselves, and neither Wyatt nor Dyani much cared about the lack. The brush arbor stood open on all 4 sides to the country beyond it, the rim rising blue-gray in the distance, the grays rolling out green from the spring rains, and Dyani had insisted on that openness, no walls, nothing closing the ceremony in, so that the land itself stood as a kind of witness alongside the people gathered under the shade. She wore a dress her aunt had sewn, special for the day, dyed a deep red that Wyatt would remember for the rest of his life as the exact color of the beadwork she'd been slow working the evening she told him she would stay. Nahilze spoke a blessing in Chiricahua that Wyatt did not fully follow, and did not need to, because the look on Dyani's face while she heard it told him everything the words themselves withheld from him. Some stories begin as a debt paid in horses, and end as something truer than either side ever expected walking into it. A chief offered a lonely cowboy the one daughter his own people had decided to cast aside. and the cowboy, given every reasonable excuse in the world to refuse, chose otherwise instead, not because it cost him nothing, but because he understood, in the way certain men simply do once the moment finally stands in front of them, exactly what he was being trusted with. Dyani arrived at that ranch carrying a bundle of belongings and a box holding a dead child's small carved horse, and a wariness she had every right to keep for the rest of her days. She chose instead to set part of that wariness down. She chose the man, the house, the garden along the south wall, the door Nahilze had never truly closed behind her. That choosing is the part worth carrying with you afterward. Not the offer, and not the horses that changed hands to make it possible. What she decided, once someone finally gave her a genuine hand to decide with. The years that followed the wedding were not without their own hard stretches, the way no honest life on that country was ever without them. A drought settled over the rim country the second summer of their marriage, that tested every rancher between Alma and Reserve, and it was Dyani's knowledge of the land, the dry season routes, and the hidden seep she had learned as a girl on Turkey Creek that carried the herd through a season that broke two of their neighbors outright. Wyatt never forgot standing at the edge of a spring. She had led him to that no map of that country had ever marked, water where the county surveyor swore there was none, and understanding all over again what he had been given the day he rode east to trade for stock, and rode home with a wife instead. Their first child, a daughter, came in the spring of the third year, born in the same room off the kitchen that had once held nothing but old leather and axle grease, and had since become, by slow and steady stages, the warmest corner of the house. They named her for Dyani's mother, a name Nahilze wept openly to hear spoken over his own great-granddaughter, the first time in all the years Wyatt had known him that the old headman had let anyone see him cry. A second child followed 2 winters later, a son this time, and by the time both children were old enough to ride, the ranch had grown to twice the size it had been the autumn Wyatt first rode east for horses, built up steadily through the kind of partnership neither of them had believed, at the outset, they would ever be trusted with. Ezra Kellam's granddaughter, grown into a young woman by the time Wyatt and Dyani's own daughter was old enough for schooling, would one day tell her own children about the Apache rancher's wife from up on the rim who had taught half the valley how to read weather off a cloud bank, and how the whole county had, eventually, come around to thinking there was no finer household between Alma and Reserve. It was not the kind of change that arrived all at once. It arrived the way most true changes do, one season and one small proof at a time, until one day the thing that had once seemed impossible was simply how things were. Bidzil was never seen again in that country. Word came down eventually, second-hand and unconfirmed the way most word was in that territory, that he had drifted north past San Carlos and taken up with a band that had no memory of Turkey Creek or the lie he had told there, and that he had never again risen to any standing worth the name. Dyani heard the news without visible feeling one way or the other. Some debts, Wyatt came to understand, simply settled themselves in their own time, and a person did not always need to watch the settling to know it had happened. Nahilze visited the ranch every spring after that first one, a standing arrangement neither side ever needed to speak aloud to keep. He watched his brother's daughter plant her garden and mend her own porch chairs, and stand beside a good man in a house that had once belonged only to that man's grief. And something in the old headman's face on those visits, Wyatt noticed, had the particular ease of a man who had spent years carrying a worry he was finally permitted to set down. Taji herself rode down once, years later, unannounced, on a gray morning in early autumn, the same season Dyani had first been cast out of the band's good graces. She stood a long while at the edge of the yard before Dyani noticed her. There and the 2 women spoke alone at the garden fence for the better part of an hour, while Wyatt kept his distance and did not ask afterward what had passed between them. Whatever it was, Dyani was quieter than usual that evening, not sorrowful, simply thoughtful, turning something over that had needed turning over for a long time. The gist of it offered to Wyatt only in passing over supper. Taji had finally been ready to name the thing she'd carried unspoken for years, that her grief had found the wrong target, and she had known it, somewhere underneath the anger the whole time. Whether Dyani forgave her went unspoken between them. Wyatt understood, watching her face that evening, that some hurts were not about forgiveness so much as about finally being seen clearly by the person who had once refused to see you at all, and that seeing, offered late, was still worth more than it not being offered at all. The ranch prospered. In the years that followed, in a way neither of them had dared hope for that first uncertain autumn. Word of the household spread slowly through the territory, not as gossip anymore, but as something closer to respect. A rancher and his Apache wife who had built, between the two of them, one of the soundest operations in that stretch of New Mexico, weathering droughts and hard winters that broke lesser outfits clean through. Young men from Alma took to riding out on the pretext of business just to see how Dyani managed her horses, and rode back having learned more in an afternoon than most of them managed in a season on their own family spreads. She never turned any of them away. She had spent enough years being turned away herself to understand exactly what it cost a person, and she was not about to hand that particular cruelty onto anyone else, regardless of what people they came from. Dyani kept the small carved horse in its box beneath the bed for the rest of her life, and every so often, on an evening when the light came in gold across the floor the way it had that first spring, Wyatt would find her holding it a while before she wrapped it back in its cloth. He never asked her to explain it, and she never offered to. Some kinds of grief, he had learned from her, were not meant to be solved. They were only meant to be carried gently, by someone who understood exactly how heavy they were, for exactly as long as they needed carrying, and that was its own kind of love too, quieter than the rest, but no less real for its quiet. The fear between two very different worlds did not vanish simply because one good man and one strong woman found each other on a hard stretch of New Mexico ground. It rarely does, not all the way, not forever. But they built a life alongside that fear, instead of letting it choose their days for them. And in that high, unforgiving country below the rim, that was its own quiet, stubborn kind of courage, the kind that never announces itself and never asks to be believed. It only keeps showing up, morning after morning, for as long as two people decide between them that it is worth showing up for. That was the whole of it. In the end, the part worth remembering long after the horses and the offer and even the danger had faded into the kind of story people tell each other on winter evenings. A cast-aside woman and a lonely rancher, each of them written off in their own way by people who should have known better, found in each other the one thing neither had believed was still available to them, a place where they were simply, finally, chosen. Not traded, not settled, chosen plainly and kept. If this story stayed with you, if any part of Dyani or Wyatt or that long ride down from Turkey Creek found something true in you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like theirs waiting to be told, and we intend to keep telling them, one hard-won choice at a time.